Okay, welcome back to Foundations of Christian Thought and Practice. We're really making a transition now. We have dealt with the 6 themes from the Hebrew Bible that I think are essential. Does it cover everything? Absolutely not. In fact, probably what I've done in the last 6 sessions has been more criminal than anything else. But we're trying to get an overview of what a Christian worldview is. And I want you to notice that I want to take the Old Testament seriously. And this is very important to me. Of course, I'm really biased toward this because this is what most of my degrees are in. I love the Old Testament. A lot of times Christians, they don't take the Old Testament seriously. And I hope by saying that we have 6 themes from the Old Testament and 6 themes from the New Testament, and then half the semester is spent in the Old Testament and vice versa for the New Testament, I hope you see, even by that I take this very seriously. Well, now we're moving into the New Testament, and we have 6 themes that I want us to address. The 7th theme is this: Jesus is the Messiah. Now, one of the problems with the themes that we're going to hear coming up, probably all 6 themes in the New Testament. One of the major problems that I have with my students who come from a Christian worldview, they are in a Christian worldview now, excuse me, or they grew up in a Christian worldview, they're used to this. And what I tell my students is, don't forget, as we move into the New Testament, that we're sitting on 2,000 years of decisions made. Decisions that have been made for us. And so remember, we talked about the canon. And the canon, which is basically the authorized books that we consider as Scripture. Those decisions have been made for us. And later on, we'll talk about the Council of Nicaea in 325. The Council of Nicaea in 325 was very important for Christians because, by the way, 325 CE in the Common Era, 325 after Christ was born. In the Council of Nicaea, they made some very important decisions. One of the decisions was to decide that Jesus was the Son of God. He was both fully God and fully man. We'll talk about that in the next theme. But another decision that was made, and this was not really a direct decision, if you will, another decision that was made in 325 was essentially what books go into the Christian Bible. What books are included in the Christian Scriptures. In many ways, they decided that they would just take the decision that the Jews made. And so the Hebrew Bible, now watch me make a distinction here, the Hebrew Bible will be the same as the Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible for the Jews will be the same as the Old Testament for the Christians. They will just adopt the decision that the Jews made essentially at the Council of Yamnia in 90 CE. But what about all the books that have been written in the last 3 centuries? If you think that there are only 4 Gospels, please think again. There are probably anywhere from about 180 to 200 Gospels. Now, only 4 of those made it into the canon: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And even though we have all of these, we call them extra canonical Gospels, even though we have all these extra Gospels, only 4 made it into the canon. Well, why? And who made that decision? Well, what I want you to see is that decision took centuries to make. And in particular, at the Council of Nicaea in 325, this is when the canon began to become more solid. It actually would take about another 75 to 100 years. But this is where finally Christians began to say, this book goes in and this book goes out. So even as we approach these themes of the New Testament, I want you to understand that we're sitting on 2,000 years of history, of interpretation, 2,000 years of decisions that have been made for us. Is that a bad thing? Absolutely not. It's a good thing, but again, we want to be self-reflective. We want to be critical. Why do we believe these things? Where did we get these views? All right, let's talk a little bit about Theme 7 as you get ready to read your essay in the workbook. Jesus is the Messiah. And you may say at this point, well, duh, of course Jesus is the Messiah. But again, take yourself back to the time when the Christians were just beginning. They were deciding Jesus had been crucified, and Paul had died in Rome somewhere between 64 and 68 CE. And so the two major founders of Christianity, Jesus and Paul, they're dead and gone by now, and I mean this humanly speaking. And people are left with the question, who were these people? Who was Jesus in particular? And was he the Messiah? Was he the Son of God? And the first issue that the early Christians have to take on, and mind you, remember that all first Christians were Jewish. That's very important. All first Christians were Jewish. And so now that Christ has come, what do they do with their Judaism? This is maybe the biggest argument in the New Testament. And it's the argument between Peter and Paul. Peter is going to teach. Now, here was Peter who spent 3 years with Christ. He is going to say that to be Christian now, to follow Christ, you still need to keep the law. You still need to keep kosher. Paul, who did not follow Christ during the ministry, the earthly ministry of Christ, Paul is going to say, no, the gospel now means that we move on from what will eventually be called Judaism. We move on from keeping the law. You don't need to keep the law anymore. You don't need to be circumcised. You don't need to keep kosher. Paul is going to argue that not only did Christ come for the Jews, but he also came for the Gentiles. And now that Christ has come, it's an entirely different landscape. So if you recall what we talked about in theme number 6 as we closed out the Old Testament, Paul is going to grasp onto this idea that God is not only the God of the Jews, God is also the God of the Gentiles. This is now a universal God, and Jesus will be the Son of God for Paul and for the early Christians. But I want you to see that this will be a really intense debate about who is Christ, who was Christ, and what does it mean to be Christian. And so if you think, I've heard people talk about this, I wish we could just get back to the New Testament church. Well, there was really no such thing. There were New Testament churches, and there were different congregations who had different books of the Bible, and they had different beliefs. And that's why the Council of Nicaea becomes so important, because this will be the first major council that will try to decide what Christians believe and what is actually orthodox. So, back to this 7th theme. Jesus is the Messiah. What was so controversial about that? Well, in the Jewish Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, the Messiah was a political figure. Actually, Messiah, it comes from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which means anointed one. And so in the Hebrew Bible, and even to Jews today who still look for the coming of the Messiah, this is a major difference between Judaism and Christianity. Christians believe that the Messiah has come, and that was Jesus. The Jews have a real problem with that, because in their mind, Jesus could not be the Messiah. Why? Because Jesus died a shameful death. And he really, now listen to me carefully, all right? Put quotes around this. Jesus didn't accomplish anything. All he did was die. Now, of course, that's ridiculous, at least from the Christian perspective, because Christ, his ministry began, if you will, at his death. And so for Christians, Jesus is the Messiah, even though he died, even though he suffered. To the Jews, Jesus couldn't be the Messiah because he misses the most important prerequisite, and that is he died a shameful death. And so all of a sudden here, now we see Judaism going, if you will, to the left and Christianity to the right. And there's a major difference here, and it comes down to the interpretation of Jesus being the Messiah. Let me say one thing before you get into your essay. Let me emphasize this. The theme that we're talking about, that Jesus is the Messiah, and you've actually got to rethink your idea of the Messiah, that comes directly from the Gospel of Mark. Straight from the Gospel of Mark. And Mark is our first gospel written that makes it into the canon. And we're pretty sure that Mark was written somewhere around 70, which is the fall of the Second Temple at the hands of the Romans. Mark is written to show that Jesus is the Messiah, and yes, he was crucified. Yes, he died a shameful death. But rather than that negating his being the Messiah, the Gospel of Mark is going to teach that that actually qualifies Jesus for being the Messiah, because the Messiah came to suffer and to die for human beings, and that becomes foundational to Christianity.